All right, so scrimmage one, boy, for a closed scrimmage, we sure got a lot of details, and not from Kirby Smart, but everybody else seemed to have all the details of what happened in scrimmage one, and a lot comes out. What's so interesting about this is depending on who's watching these scrimmages are the reports you get, right? So if it's big-time donors, well, they're not exactly, football coaches, so they're maybe watching it a different way. Other people have other sources, I'm sure, as well, but it kind of does frame how we all look at things because, like we said, Kirby Smart didn't give us much after that first scrimmage.
I'm just slowly hoping that one day, Kirby's so tired of the leaks, he just, decides to reverse course with everything he's done and let reporters come and watch scrimmage themselves. That way we're not getting second and third hand sourcing on these things, and we have a truly, I think, better idea of how things actually went.
There was a day when, the coaches, Mark Richt, I can remember walking into the room and giving stats on the scrimmage. It doesn't happen anymore, and even Kirby's like, man, he did okay, when we know a guy had an excellent day. All right, so as we look ahead to the second scrimmage and some of the things we are looking to hear about, that would be injuries. Injuries, knock on wood, have not been a huge factor so far in this camp. I think last week, Kirby Smart, one of the things he did tell us, Malachi Tolliver's dealing with the foot. But that's all we've heard about injuries. That seems to be so far so good on that front.
Right, and it's such a 180 from where Georgia was this time a year ago, where you were dealing with guys early in the season picking up injuries. And even before that Alabama game, you had Michael Williams pick up an injury. You had Tate Ratledge deal with an injury. That defensive line never was really healthy in the early part of that season. And so if Georgia's able to weather the storm a little bit here, and they're able to get through this scrimmage clean and stay healthy, I think that's really big for a team. Now, granted, they don't open this season with a traditional big game like in years past you've seen with a Clemson or an Oregon. And if they're able to get healthy for a young team that needs to come together and needs as many reps as it can have, I think that's huge. Conversely, you look at a team like Florida, it seems like every other day there's injury news coming out about them. I think that really hurts a team going into this season. So the fact that you're able to stay healthy through the month of August, I think is really big, especially for a young team where these guys are still able to get a lot of the key learning reps. Whereas once you get in season, you're focusing more on each individual opponent on a week-by-week basis.
And it sounded like that first scrimmage, they were really getting after it. I mean, there was a lot of tackling, and Kirby talked a lot about how they weren't tackling up to snuff, and he wants to see that. But that will taper off as they get closer to the season to end season. It'll just be that thud, and we're not taking people to the ground. So it's not like they're not getting after it. They're just lucky so far with the injuries.
Yeah, and especially when one of the two big talking points from the offensive and defensive sides are, on the offensive side, we want to run the ball. Well, you got to be physical to do that. Defensively, they got to tackle better. You've actually got to hit and tackle people, and that does open up some injuries to there in that regard. So I think that is something to monitor going into the second scrimmage. How physical are they? And when we get to hear from Kirby Smart on this, and how did the tackling improve? Because if both those boxes can get checked and Georgia can still be healthy, that is a massive, massive win for Georgia in fall camp.
All right, so there was a lot to talk about the transfers, and we'll get to that in just a minute after scrimmage one. But scrimmage one, tell me about the freshmen you want to hear about this week. And I don't feel like we heard a ton about, correct me if I'm wrong, about the freshmen in that first scrimmage.
Yeah, I think the exception is maybe Juan Gaston, and that's because of the hole that is open on the offensive line there. But you didn't hear a ton necessarily about Zayden Walker, a guy I mentioned earlier. Elijah Griffin didn't really pop. It was interesting to people that J.J. Hanna was playing with the first-team defense. It's not necessarily true that he was excelling out there, but they've got a lot of guys that I think can come in and play right away. You look at a guy like Talon Taylor. Georgia's going to have about 6 wide receivers they play in their rotation. If Taylor can crack that rotation, I think that's going to say a lot about his ability and his potential for Georgia in 2025. Bo Walker is another guy we mentioned earlier, had a huge spring. Has done okay so far in fall camp. The noise maybe hasn't been as big around him as there have been some other running backs. And then even at tight end, you look at a guy like an Elias Williams. What can you see from him? Can he push a Jaden Riddell, even an Oscar Dell potentially for playing time? At the skill player positions in particular, I'm very interested in seeing how these guys come out and play during their second scrimmage. Now that they've got their feet under them and have a little bit better of an idea of what to expect moving forward.
Yeah, cruising through some of the pictures that Georgia put out from the scrimmage, you did see Talon Taylor making a catch or two. What that means and, how all that looks is really the other interesting. You talk about J.J. Hanna with the fire, passion, and energy guardian cap on there was another interesting thing to see. All right, offensive guard battle. We heard again, next to nothing from Kirby Smart this week. They asked him, he gave us about 2 sentences. He did say he wants to see size and mass there. Well, you got size and mass with some of the guys that are all working to try and secure that right guard spot.
Yeah, the Whisper campaign is pushing very strongly for Juan Gaston right now, and I think it'll be interesting, especially when you get to Tennessee, when you get to Alabama. That's what I'm really going to take note of, who's in at that right guard position and how often someone is playing, because with Juan in particular, there's been so much talk about his weight, his conditioning, and getting everything in check in that regard, which leaves open the door for a Daniel Calhoun, for a Michael Inouye. And the fact that neither of those guys have really separated at that job at this point, I think is a big reason why Gaston has a chance to ultimately go on and win that starting right guard job. But it only takes one great practice and one bad practice to really swing this one way or the other. And the reality is, Georgia's going to want all three of these guys, because we saw last year, injuries were such an issue for the Georgia offensive line. And if you have three guys who can potentially come in and help you at the guard spot, while that's not an ideal situation to be in when you're having to rotate in all those guys, I think it'll help this line tremendously as they look to form a more cohesive unit in 2025.
Yeah, and you think about that spot as well. We've seen Georgia, I feel like, and maybe other programs I just don't notice, rotate the offensive lineman more, it feels like, than anybody else. That right guard spot seems like somewhere where it could be Daniel Calhoun, you get this drive, and then the next guy goes in for the next drive, and you got Drew Bobo next to you, you got... That would be Ernest Green, right, on that right tackle spot. Veteran. So they can go, hey, man, this is what we're doing. You know, even if you don't know the play as a freshman or there's some stuff going on, they know they can look out for that guy when you've got the offensive coordinator's son and a guy who's been on the field for 3 seasons.
Absolutely.
All right, next one. More defensive line news. That was kind of we saw the video Georgia put out. Christian Miller makes a big tackle there. But that was like it. And we on this program, when I filled in, I think the last time, we talked about those other defensive tackles we wanted to start hearing about. Nazir Johnson, Xavier McLeod, Nnamdi Ogboko. Those guys are the guys that are really going to have to fill in the depth on the defensive line this year. We know the frontline guys are probably going to be pretty strong, but we didn't hear much about anybody else.
Yeah, and to your point, Cody, the fact that Christian Miller is the only defensive lineman we see making a play, it's kind of worrying to me, just in the sense that, like, you know what you have in Christian Miller. He's the most established player on this defensive line. They're going to need other guys to go out there and play and contribute. I'm not saying they need to necessarily go out there and be stars and quote-unquote earn a starting spot, but you need to have guys that you can trust, and you need to have guys that can go out there and make plays and do what they're asked to do. And so, you know, Jordan Hall, you'd love to hear him having a big scrimmage and him being disruptive. And one of the things with these scrimmages, you know, if one position has a great day, that probably means who they were going against means they didn't necessarily have the best time. And it sounds like while the offensive line is doing well and things are moving in a great direction there, which I think is much needed news after how last season ended, the defensive line is my biggest concern going into this season, just with what we've seen from Georgia and how they've gone about winning championships. And coming out of this first scrimmage, I actually came away even somehow more worried about what this unit might look like in 2025 than necessarily we were even going into it.
The only thing I'll say about this, and it's kind of what we talked about earlier, is think of the folks who are leaking this information, right? These are donors. It's easy to see Christian Miller break through the line and make a tackle in the backfield. But if a guy just kind of stuffs the run at the line of scrimmage and Bo Walker or, you know, Nate Frazier gets to the line and has nowhere to go, is that a win in the defensive lineman's book? Maybe that's a positive play, but I don't know that that's going to stick out to the average fan who's kind of seeing 22 guys running all over the place. And even, you know, there's times where I'll shoot a game from field level and you're not sure who made the tackle and what really was the case there. So that's the only reason I would say maybe consider the source on some of that.
Absolutely. And you think of the way the Georgia defensive line so famously wants to play. 2 on me, someone's free. They want their defensive linemen to hold up blocks, to open up holes for linebackers to go and shoot through. And so Georgia, having the linebacker room that they have, I think maybe leans into that a little bit, but you want to hear, hey, I thought Joseph Jonah-Ajayi looked really good out there today. To your point, Nasir Johnson, Nnamdi Ogboko, those guys were doing things on the interior of the defensive line and making things difficult for the Georgia offense, because if this team's going to win in 2025, this defensive line is going to have to make a massive leap from where it is starting the season to where it could potentially be at the end of the year.
And I also think there were a lot of eyes on Elijah Griffin, right? Like wherever he goes, everybody wants to see what's going on with number 90 out there. So we want to hear good things there. All right, final one will be the wide receivers who, by all reports that we've heard, I think even Kirby, did Kirby confirm that Noah Thomas had a long touch? I've heard that like so many different places. And Zach Branch did a lot of really impressive things as well. So we can see those guys do more big things. That's good.
Yeah, it sounds like coming out of that first scrimmage, Colby Young, Noah Thomas, Zach Branch, all in great spots going into the season. There's been consistently strong buzz about London Humphreys and the way that he has been able to practice and do all sorts of things for Georgia this year. We touched earlier on the show on Dylan Bell, who you see on your screen right there. I just find it hard to believe that he's not going to be a key piece of this wide receiver rotation this year, even if he is not necessarily having the best fall camp. And so for me, Georgia usually likes to play about 6 wide receivers and have 6 guys that consistently plays and shuffles in. Who's going to take that 6th spot? Who's going to go out there and make plays this coming Saturday and show what they can do? Because odds are it's probably going to have to be someone on the younger side. Can we see a Sokobi White take a step forward and go out there and make some plays? We mentioned Talon Taylor earlier in the freshman segment, what he's able to do. I think CJ Wiley is another guy who deserves mention there. This is a dart throw of a name and something that is probably to monitor later in the season. Thomas Blackshear has earned some very nice praise this season. Now, he came in the summer, and that's usually not a great recipe for playing right away, especially at a wide receiver position. But the conversation around Blackshear at least has been in-ringing enough to me, where I'm monitoring what he's doing in this scrimmage this Saturday, and if he has a big day, can he force himself into that Georgia rotation, where it sounds like the veterans or the guys that have played significant college football before are doing all the things that you want to see from this group.
And one of the other things about that, and really for all of these positions, people talk so much about, Georgia doesn't have a Clemson to start the year. Does that change the way these guys are approaching things? To me, if you're one of these guys who is the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th wide receiver, I need to move myself up the depth chart even one spot, because all of a sudden at the end of the Marshall game or in the second half of the Austin Peay game, these are guys who are going to be able to get reps, and you want to be higher on the depth chart to be the guy who gets his number called when the second half of that game comes around and everybody's getting into the game. So to me, that would push the middle of the pack a little bit harder maybe than the frontline starter said, oh, we got to get ready for this one. No, I'm competing with the guy right next to me to get playing time, because I know playing time is going to be available in week 1 and week 2.
To your point, Cody, I think it's a great thing for this team this year with how young they are, with how much guys I think have to go out there and improve, and that's why you've heard so much talk about fire, passion, and energy, that they're opening with a Marshall, that they're opening with an Austin Peay, where even in the second half of that game, if Georgia's able to get out to big leads in both of those, they're going to be able to play guys and sort of see what they have. Whereas if you're taking on a Clemson, we mentioned Oregon in the years past, they're going to open with Louisville, Florida State moving forward. Those games are just different animals, and you're just looking to get a win that day. With Marshall and Austin Peay, with this team being this young and this mid-pack, as you sort of mentioned there, not just a wide receiver, but across the roster, it's a massive, massive opportunity for them. And how these guys set themselves up in their second scrimmage, I think is going to go a long way determining what it ultimately looks like when the games are for real in late August and early September.
Do you think that played into last year when you get to the UMass games and some of these Mississippi State, these games that should have been blowouts and it didn't seem like it got there? Was that because there's older guys in there and they're like, I know I can roll the football out and win?
And I know that that's one of the real regrets, Cody, from last season, that the Mississippi State game was as close as it was in the second half. In the UMass game, Georgia just didn't really come ready to play. And that hurt that team later in the year when injuries mounted, and you didn't have young players who had the opportunity, who had the reps to play real football, even if it is against lesser competition. Those reps are still incredibly valuable. And so I think Kirby understands that. And that's why I'd be really, really surprised this season with the Marshall game, with that Austin Peay game, if Georgia doesn't come out buttoned up, ready to go from the start. I'm not saying they're going to show exotic looks and really tilt their hand for what they might have against Tennessee and Alabama, but from playing hard, from everything we've heard this camp, that's going to be a major point of emphasis going into these first 2 games for Georgia.
And final point on the wide receivers, it does seem like night and day from last summer when, Brandon Adams like, hey man, we're not hearing anything about these wide. That cannot be good. We're hearing so much now. That seems to be a better sign.
Yeah, and to that point, that proved to be a harbinger of what was to come during the season. They enter with Ra Thomas being dismissed, and now you just see where they are. I think there's a chance that this wide receiver room, there's going to be a lot on the arm of Gunnar Stockton, but this is just sort of the way college football can be sometimes, where some years, you don't have all the pieces line up rightly, and where last year you think if Carson Beck had this wide receiver room, what would that team have looked like? But I think they recognized that, hey, we need more from our wide receivers last year from the lessons that they learned. And they made sure that Gunnar Stockton isn't going to be in the same position that Carson Beck was last year.
All right, we'll see what happens scrimmage too. You better believe DawgNation.com and our YouTube channels will have all the reaction that we are hearing. And like we said, from Scrimmage 1, we got a lot of insiders, a lot of places. We'll be sharing all that information with you as well. Now, Georgia gets those first 2 weeks. They got to be buttoned up, though, when they take the trip to Rocky Top on September 13th. And we here at Dawg Nation have got to be buttoned up as we take the trip to Rocky Top on September 13th. We've already got a big day planned. It includes our Dawg Nation invasion on the Tennessee River. Excited about getting on the riverboat. We did it back in 2023. It led Georgia to a win, a blowout win over Tennessee, so we'll be doing it again. We have got a riverboat that just Dawg Nation will be on, going up and down the river. We got the food, we got the drink, we got those barking dog people on there, and all of that Vol Navy is just going to turn green and even uglier orange with envy as they see us cruising up and down past Neyland Stadium before the game. You want to get on there with us? You can do that. Sign up today, DawgNation.com/tailgate. Why do you want to do it now? Don't wait for another couple weeks, because the first 125 folks who sign up are going to get this sweet shirt. Look at it in red. It says Sink Rocky Top. It's almost got the bulldog like a pirate ship there. I love that. And it's going to be beautiful weather to be out. It was a little bit later in the year in 23. September in Knoxville, Tennessee, cruising on the river. That is going to be awesome. So you want to get your shirt right there as well, because they're doing that checkerboard thing at Neyland, I think, that day. You want to have red in there to disrupt everything. So get your red Sink Rocky Top shirt by signing up for our Dawg Nation invasion. You can do that. DawgNation.com/tailgate. You can get your tickets there today.